This video introduces the experiment and different types of experiments. The experiment is the prime instrument of empirical social research. It is about focusing on the variables that are actually of interest. In the simplest case, a variable x that influences a variable y. In principle, the experiment is characterized by the elimination of as many confounding variables as possible that influence it from outside. In the field, in reality, thousands of variables are permanently active in parallel, so that it is often not possible to investigate the relationship between the variables of interest cleanly and without the influence of these external confounding variables. Therefore, one often goes to the laboratory, isolates the two variables under consideration, and tries to investigate the relationship in more detail. The simplest case is x influences y, and this is called direct causality. It can also be the other way around, perhaps even reversed over time. First, x influences y, then y again influences x, so that one speaks of a reversed causality. It is also possible that there are background variables, that x and y are somehow related but still have a common underlying cause. A couple of examples are shown on the right-hand side of the slide. Often the connections are quite complex, especially when time is taken into account. There may be an interaction, there may be indirect causalities, but these are defined by hypotheses in advance, in order to then also carry out the corresponding empirical investigation in the experiment. Here, a clear hypothesis-oriented approach is advisable. Hypotheses form the starting point of the empirical investigation because one wants to exclude from the outset as many variables as possible that have nothing to do with the variables actually considered. In other words, one wants to focus on the relationship of interest, in our case between the two variables x and y. A typical feature of experiments is that in the simplest case one has two groups, also called conditions. One group is the control group, and the other group is the experimental group. And this experimental group, which we confront with a certain stimulus, should then, according to the hypotheses, react differently than the control group. All this is typically being checked in advance, in the context of the so-called manipulation check. This is important in order to see whether the manipulation carried out by the researcher actually has an effect on the subsequent behavior and the naming and judgments of the participants. Even when we are in the laboratory, a number of confounding effects naturally occur, such as the special emphasis on variables in the subsequent survey. It can also be a matter of social desirability to analyze facts that are very much shaped by cognitive and emotional norms, that people find it difficult to get involved in the experiment, that there are observer effects in the form that the presence of the researcher plays a role in the responding behavior of the participants. All these are potential biases that one tries to eliminate as much as possible in order to cleanly get to the cause and effect relationship between x and y. In this respect, such an investigation requires careful planning in order to get closer to the actual facts. A final important aspect regarding design of experiments is the distinction between real experiment and quasi-experiment. In a real experiment, participants are randomly assigned to the experimental group and the control group in order to eliminate as many interfering variables as possible through random assignment. In a quasi-experiment, however, this is not possible because the variables, for instance age and gender, cannot simply be changed in a person. In this respect, potential confounding variables must be controlled for. This is not always easy and requires a lot of care to set up the experimental design accordingly.